All right, so this is the last section of notes for Unit 2. I will present the slide. So this is going to be Native Americans and Westward expansion. So, first thing that we need to talk about, there are tribes in the Great Plains. This is the area that's known as the Great Plains. If you've ever taken a geography class, so we're in the southeast, Alabama is around, this area. This is Atlanta, okay? You've got the Great Basin, you've got the California area, Plateau, in the northeast, and the southwest. But this is the area we'll focus on for the Great Plains tribes. This area stretched from Canada to Mexico, and many of these tribes were farmers or they were nomadic. Nomad means that they roam for their food. They are not stable. They don't have a set place to live. They move around, usually depending on where their food was. Buffalo to these tribes was a sacred animal. All right, if you look here, this is a picture. This is the American bison or buffalo. It was sacred to the Plains Native Americans. Every single part of the buffalo was used. They didn't leave scraps. It also says nomadic tribes fought with one another sometimes. You also have your Southwest tribes. So this is your Southwest. All right. So again, the Southwest tribes were either farmers or nomads. Some tribes raided other tribes' villages for supplies. And if you look here, this says the Apache chief Geronimo and some of his warriors in 1886. Geronimo has been in several, he was in some Johnny Depp movie a while back where they played Geronimo and a cowboy. I forgot the name of the movie, but anyway. All right, so the American West. Very few cities on the American West and the Pacific Coast. There were not a lot of people at that point. It was also kind of known as the Wild West because there was nobody there. There wasn't really a lot of a law, as they say. These were mostly made up of farmers, miners, ranchers who lived on the frontier. Most Western Native Americans lived on their tribal lands. In 1834, the U.S. government designated the Great Plains as one large Indian reservation. So this is the Sioux camp near the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1891. Notice they've got the teepees. So what's going to happen is, at some point in time, obviously, we have the California Gold Rush, which is where everybody wants to move out to California to try to make money because they've discovered gold. Some passed through for the gold rush, so some people went straight through the Midwest to California, but other people wanted to stay. So what happened then? The U.S. government changed the Great Plains reservation policy, and they created treaties that defined specific boundaries for each tribe. But what happened is brutal fighting took place. Most treaties were ignored, like in the East. For example, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, it was signed between the U.S. government and the Cheyenne, Crow, Blackfeet, Arapaho, I'm not sure how to pronounce this one, and the Sioux. These tribes agreed to friendship with one another. The terms of the treaty was that the U.S. government would give each tribe $50,000 each year for 10 years. It also said that the U.S. government would be allowed to build roads and forts along the Overland Trail and that settlers could travel the trail. So this was the terms of their agreement. It says that boundaries were established where tribes could hunt and fish. However, if any tribe violated this treaty, the U.S. would not give them money. Peace eventually would not last. These are the boundaries as determined by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. If you notice, you've got numbers here, and you've also shows which tribes belong in which area. Okay? Now we also get to the Homestead Act of 1862. This opened up Western settlement to United States. It allowed any American, including African Americans, former enslaved people, and women, to claim up to 160 acres of land if he or she lived on it for 5 years. So what happened? The Southern African Americans, which nicknamed exodusters, moved west to escape discrimination and racism of the South. 270 million acres would eventually be claimed. So again, they were trying to expand the territory of the United States, and they were also trying to get more people to kind of spread out. Not all land was equal, though. I'm sure some of you have seen. I mean, we've got areas of Tuscaloosa that are just swamps. So some was better for farming than others. In this picture, just exodusters leaving the South for the West in 1879. So this is the massacre at Sand Creek. It happened on November 29th, 1864. These were 800 Cheyenne Indian tribes, tribal members living in southeast Colorado near an area known as Sand Creek. Their chief, Black Kettle, was told that his people were safe. However, they were not. Colonel John M. Chivington led the Colorado Volunteers in attack. Black Kettle waved an American flag, but 150 of his people were brutally killed. So these Colorado Volunteers, I'm assuming, thought that this Indian tribe was not friendly. But the Cheyenne tribe, if you remember, had already made an agreement with the American government, so they were protected. Now we get to the Bozeman Trail. This ran through the Sioux territory. The Sioux chief, Red Cloud, asked the U.S. government to prevent settlers from using the trail because it disrupted the Sioux ways of life. However, the U.S. government refused. In 1866, the Sioux warrior Crazy Horse, which is a very, very famous Sioux warrior, ambushed the U.S. troops working on the trail, and over 80 Americans were killed. In 1868, the U.S. government agreed to close the trail. Back to the Treaty of Fort Laramie, it gave large tracts of land in the Black Hills of the Dakotas to the Sioux and the Cheyenne. And then it says the Sioux chief Sitting Bull refused to sign this treaty. He's also a very famous chief. Okay, this is the trail. More broken treaties. So this is, again, the United States not holding to their agreement between the Native Americans. You have the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, created 2 reservations in Indian Territory, one for the Comanche and the Kiowa, one for the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho. The U.S. government agreed to provide them with housing, food, supplies, and weapons for hunting. And in return, the tribes could continue to hunt on any lands south of the Arkansas River as long as they would stop raids on settlers. The U.S. did not enforce this treaty. So buffalo hunters moved into the hunting grounds and slaughtered thousands of buffalo for fur. What do you remember about the buffalo? Previously, we talked about how the Native Americans treated the buffalo as it was, very favored in their culture. They used every single piece of item from the buffalo when they killed it. So that was, a sacred animal. By 1878, almost all of the buffalo in this area was killed off. So, of course, if that's the main food source for the Native Americans, now what happened? That means they had to rely on the U.S. government for rations. Rations are small food supplies, but it was not enough to feed the Native Americans in this area. As a result, you have the Red River War. It began in 1874. Native Americans eventually surrendered in the June of 1875. There was also Native American resistance in the southern Great Plains. It was over. This is the Kiowa Native American prisoners from the Red River War in Florida of 1875. Another war, we have the Great Sioux War, 1876 to 1877. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and settlers ignored the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and they invaded Native American territory. So they broke the agreement. U.S. Army General George Armstrong Custer ordered to relocate Native Americans living in the Bighorn Mountains to reservations. So again, they removed them off of their land because the Americans were trying to, take the gold. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse decided to fight, and they gathered warriors. So again, I told you he's a very famous Native American tribe member. So this is Sitting Bull, and this is a picture of the Bighorn Mountains. So now we have the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we have June 26, 1876. General Custer found village on banks of Little Bighorn River. He attacked the village, which was the main encampment of the Sioux and the Cheyenne tribes. Crazy Horse and Chief Sitting Bull led over 3,000 against Custer's 210 men. It lasted less than an hour. It was also called Custer's Last Stand. Now you need to keep in mind, the American troops had rifles and weapons, okay? So this is a picture of a pile of bones on the Little Bighorn battlefield of 1877, and this is a painting of the fight, the Custer fight. The aftermath of the Battle of Little Bighorn. Victory was short-lived, but the U.S. Army increased efforts to force Native Americans onto reservations or kill them. This is an example of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Imagine if let's just put it into perspective. So the Native Americans believed that the land was sacred, that the land belonged to everybody. So imagine if you are now told that you are not allowed to live in your area where you grew up, and you are put into a small area, a small fenced-in territory, and you were told that you cannot leave that area. That's what's happening here. It's very cruel. So Sitting Bull and his followers were chased into Canada, but they had to surrender in 1881 because of starvation. This is the U.S. Army overlooking the Pine Ridge Reservation of 1891. We'll talk more a little bit later on about how reservations have really kind of ruined the Native American population and all the damage it's done to them. So we'll discuss that a little bit later. Slaughter of the buffalo. All right, so attempt to defeat Native Americans. They kill off the main food supply. If you've never seen a Gatling gun, let's pause for a second. All right, so I just want to show you this really quickly because this is a pretty intense weapon, but it is kind of one of my favorites as far as a military gun. So this is the Gatling gun, and I'll show you what it does.
It was a tremendous and terrifying advancement in 19th century warfare. The Gatling gun could fire 100, even 200 rounds across the battlefield in the time it took an enemy soldier standing in the line of fire to charge his muzzle-loading rifle and fire once. A 100-to-1 advantage in shots downrange.
It made so many different inroads in history, in firearms manufacture, use, and technology. It's unbelievable.
Gary Harper owns 2 Gatling guns, restored originals. He does exhibitions at shooting matches so history buffs can experience the Gatling's remarkable power.
Okay, so back to this. So the Gatling guns, so this gave railroad companies permission to kill the buffalo, and like you saw, the firepower of the Gatling guns, so they just really laid waste to the buffalo, right? They also stopped trains so passengers could shoot the buffalo, and hunters were encouraged to kill as many as they could. Buffalo robes, kind of like, furs and things, but these were made of buffalo skins, became popular in the East. In 1865, there were 15 million buffalo, but in 1900, there were only a few hundred left. They almost became extinct. The buffalo, like we said, was sacred to the Native Americans, and they would kill any settler they could. All right, I think this is Nez Perce. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sorry. The surrender. So the settlers invaded in 1877 because of the gold. The U.S. government demanded 90% of their land. Chief Joseph retreated to Canada with his people, but they were chased 1,700 miles from Idaho through Montana. They did not make it. They were surrendered. They surrendered. Okay. Oops, sorry. I need to edit this. That was not supposed to be there. The entire tribe was forcibly relocated to Oklahoma. Unfortunately, half of them died from disease and starvation as they were marched to Oklahoma. So, allies to reservations. The Pawnee Indians were allies of the United States, and they were also scouts for the U.S. Army. They were tribes that protected the railroad workers in Nebraska, and they also gave the Army information. They helped jack down other tribes. And it says, by late 1870, Pawnee scouts were no longer used. Most of the Pawnee were forcibly removed from their lands to Oklahoma. The ghost dance. Most Native Americans were living on reservations. The Wovoka, a Paiute holy man, received a message from the Creator in 1888. He said that a Messiah would come and the world would be free of the white man. Native Americans would return to their lands and the buffalo would roam the Great Plains again. It said it would also happen in the spring of 1891. Native Americans meditated, changed, and danced. That's supposed to be chanted and danced. So this is the ghost dance. It spread to the west and the southwest, and the Wovoka encouraged peace. So more about the ghost dance. Settlers and soldiers were fearful of rebellion. The Sioux in South Dakota warned to stop the ghost dance. The U.S. Army were called in December of 1890, and Chief Sitting Bull was actually killed. I want to say there is a movie about this, by the way. Chief Bigfoot led 300 Sioux from reservations to safety, and the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army found them and took them to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek. And this is where we have the massacre at Wounded Knee. In December 29th, they ordered the Sioux to give up their weapons. And keep in mind, remember, the Sioux had already made a treaty with the United States government, but now they were turning their back on them. A shot rang out, and the 7th Cavalry opened fire. Almost all of the 300 men, women, and children were brutally killed or left to freeze to death. The last mass killing of Native Americans by the U.S. government, but this ended the Native American resistance in the Great Plains. So they killed women and children too. This is a picture of the aftermath of the Wounded Knee Massacre. So now we still continue to have Native American resistance in the Southwest. So in this scenario, you have the Apache tribes, which were led by Geronimo. What happened was they attacked settlements in Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico. They were actually attacking American citizens. The U.S. Army, in turn, hunted them down. They even crossed over into Mexico to look for these tribes. When the Army could not capture Geronimo, Apache women were captured and deported to Florida. The Army then cut off their food supply because they were trying to starve them out. And eventually Geronimo was captured in 1886. This is pictured here, called Geronimo's Surrender. Native American resistance at that point in the Southwest ended after Geronimo's surrender. Back to the Homestead Act of 1889. The U.S. government opened up Oklahoma Territory of this settlement, even though it was Indian territory, so they went back on their word again. This was supposed to be a Native American settlement or reservation, but now they are opening it up to other American citizens who wanted to come and settle and build houses. In April 22nd, 1889, at noon, settlers were given access to 2 million acres that had not been assigned to a specific tribe. All 2 million acres were taken in just hours. Sooners, that's what their nickname, grabbed their land before noon. By nightfall, Oklahoma City was established with 10,000 living in tents. And this is a picture. This is some more maps of the Homestead Act. This is Oklahoma. If you also know about their football team, they're nicknamed the Sooners. Reservation life. So we're going to talk about how just cruel it was for these Native Americans who were put on Indian reservations. Most suffered. You had nomadic tribes that were typically used to move around. They were forced to stay in one place. And most of the land that they crammed these Native Americans on were unsuitable for farming. The enemy tribes were forced to live side by side. Disease spread quickly, and many of these Native Americans began to abuse alcohol. This is an example. This is a picture of the Native American chiefs on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1891. And then we get to the Dawes Act. So in 1887, the Dawes Severalty Act was passed, and they tried to resolve problems with reservation life. Each family was offered 160 acres of reservation land to own. Single Native Americans were given 80 acres. Land not given to Native Americans was sold to settlers, and profits were supposed to be given to Native Americans so they could buy supplies. What happened was the Native Americans would farm the land and they kept the profits. They wanted Native Americans to become independent and to assimilate. Now, assimilate means that they wanted them to kind of start to blend in with American culture. So, under the Dawes Act, these Native Americans could become U.S. citizens after 25 years. Unfortunately, according to this act, the Native Americans did not benefit. They did not receive profits from the land sold. By 1932, over 2/3 of the territory was actually owned by settlers. So that, again, they went against their word. The American government did. Most Native Americans actually resisted the Dawes Act. They did not want to assimilate. They did not believe that land could be owned. Remember, I told you that the Native Americans believed that land was for everyone. They also were most unsuccessful at farming because of climate and soil. A lot of these Native Americans, or some of them, were not farmers, they were nomads. So what happened, another issue that they did, the federal government forced these Native Americans to assimilate. They wanted to push them into American culture. But the problem was these tribes and these Native Americans had very different culture than American culture. So reservation schools were built so children could learn to read and write English. They forced these children to attend school, and the police would come to the home if the student was absent. They forced these Native Americans to wear American clothing and to cut their hair short. In a Native American tribe, your hair is very important. Most males in the Native American culture do not cut their hair. And again, if you've seen a lot of women in Native American culture, they also have their hair long as well. So it's part of their identity. So when you make them cut their hair short, it's very disrespectful. Names were also Americanized. So they kind of stripped it from their cultural identity. Loss of culture and being forced to adopt white ways were also devastating. The Apache youth in Western clothing, this is a picture at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. It was a boarding school, and if you've never heard of a boarding school, that's basically where your parents ship you off, and you have to live in this school away from home while you get an education. Lost land. So by 1900, land held by Native Americans was half of that it was in 1880, and the land held continued to shrink. So this is a picture of before and after. The Dawes Act was repealed in 1934, but the damage had been done. These Native American groups that were once thriving and once very strong tribes, they were reduced to alcoholism, illiteracy, which means they could not read. They also were forced into poverty, and unfortunately suicide rates were actually a lot higher for Native Americans than any other ethnic group in the United States. Today, many Native Americans still face the same hardships. We also continue with the expansion of railroads. Railroads increased the number of settlers to the west. It was easier and cheaper. The Transcontinental Railroad was built in 1863 and 1869. This connected the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Majority of the laborers, we said, were mostly Chinese immigrants. We said they were paid much less than white laborers, and the work was very dangerous. You had blasts, landslides, and a lot of people actually froze to death. So this is a picture of the summit. The summit is the very top of the Sierra Nevada mountains with the Central Pacific Railroad tracks. Oop, there was a P. Okay. Also down at the bottom, railroads changed Native Americans' way of life. All right. So what was life like in the West for, Americans who actually moved there? Settlers built homes from the earth because of lack of trees. Typically, houses were built out of wood, but because these areas, the Great Plains, there's hardly any trees there. It's mostly just flat land. So if you look here, this is an example of a soddy house that they have used to build blocks of grass. Okay. And then also we have what is known as a dugout house. That's actually a house that's built into the side of a cliff or a hill. Women played an active role. They helped plow and harvest crops. These people also learned to shear sheep and produce wool to make clothing. They learned medicinal trades and things like that. They also started schools and churches to help build a sense of community. So some of the technology that was very important for life in the West. You had to have farming machinery, the steel plow, for example. This is a plow. You also have the mechanical reaper and the steel windmill. So then we go to the mining industry. Thousands, like we said, flocked west, the gold rush for gold and silver. They also wanted to mine for copper, zinc, and lead. A lot of people, most people, did not strike it rich. Prospectors worked for companies that used large machinery. Another thing that we start to see are mining towns. They're also called boom towns. And that's where you found mostly men who were trying to work in the mines. African Americans, Chinese, and Mexicans were employed, and typically the companies were owned by whites. In 1882, the federal law passed that banned Chinese participation in the mining industry. Environmental damage also happened. So what occurred? You're digging up these rock and things like that. And what would happen? It says rock dust dumped into the riverbeds that created silt deposits, which means that it gets down to the bottom of the river. Farms and towns were then flooded. So this picture here, land stripped of trees and grass by the Yuba River in California in 1866. Another thing that you did with when you're mining, they started to unfortunately release poisonous underground gases. So this is a picture of the hydraulic mining washes away earth. It also causes erosion, which means now you've got landslides that you've got to worry about. And then it says strip mining caused erosion because trees and grasses were removed. We also see an increase in the cattle industry or a demand for beef. The American cowboys, this is where we kind of get this idea of the cowboy. They learned from the Mexican cowboys. They wore spurs, chaps, they ate jerky, and they worked on ranches. Southern Texas, they had a cattle that was raised on open prairies. And what they did is they had these cowboys, and that's kind of where we get this picture of the American cowboy. They had to drive the cattle from the ranch to the market. And when I say drive, they're not putting them in a car. It means that they actually have to herd the cattle, and the cowboys are usually, around the edges of the cattle, and they make them, push them, kind of follow them to market, which was usually in another state or another area. The Chisholm Trail ran 1,500 miles from San Antonio, Texas to Abilene, Kansas. Abilene, Dodge City, Ellsworth, they were also popular railroad towns. So these cattle drives here, it says that they could take months for cowboys to drive cattle. They drove cattle from more than one ranch. They also had to brand them. Life of a cowboy was very dangerous. Lightning bolts could start stampedes, and if you get crushed by a stampede, I'm sure you've seen The Lion King, you know what that's like. Cattle could get also washed away in, cattle could also get washed away in river crossings. So the need for cowboys decreased as the railroads expanded, because eventually what they started to do is they would put the cows on the railroad cars and just ship them that way. So, unfortunately, one of the things that hindered the cattle industry is that when you had people who moved out to these areas and they started to build their own houses and take their own land, it would hinder the cattle industry, because these people relied on the open plains. Ranchers would fence off their claim, and Native Americans were also affected by barbed wire. Barbed wire was used to keep their animals inside the fence. So that means that these cattle could now not roam freely. The buffalo could not roam freely, but settlers were very protective over their land claims. And the struggle of the farmers. To farm in the West, it was not easy. More crops caused prices to drop, which decreased farmers' profits. They also had to plow more land and plant more seeds. And so what they had to do is they had to take out loans just to pay for the farm machinery, which makes them go into debt. You also have to face hot summers, droughts, insect blights that ruin the whole field. What we'll get to during the Great Depression, we'll start to talk about the Dust Bowl. And that's another thing that happened out in the Midwest, because when it gets very dry and it does not rain for a long period of time, you now have a lot of dust from the dirt. These people became angry at the railroad industry because it was expensive to transport goods. So the farmers decide that they're going to fight back. In 1867, we talked about the Grange that was founded. They held social events to fight isolation. They discussed politics. They also called for the state legislatures to take control of the railroad industry. And in 1874, they passed Granger laws, which established maximum shipping rates that railroads could charge. So that means that the railroads could no longer overcharge these people. Members of farmer alliances won seats in state legislations. So they tried to influence economics. They wanted inflation, which was a price of goods increase. The problem was consumers would be hurt, but farmers would increase profits. Inflation is not a good thing for the consumer. So we'll talk about that later. In 1873, the U.S. government declared all money must be backed by gold. This was known as the gold standard. The farmers wanted the U.S. government to print greenback dollar bills, which were not backed by gold. You could print more money, but it would cause inflation. The Greenback Party and the Greenback Labor political parties were established, but they did not gain enough support. This goes back to, now we talked about the Populist Party. They wanted wealthier Americans to pay higher taxes. They wanted senators to be directly elected by the people. They wanted citizens to vote on the bills. They wanted a one-term presidency. And they had nominated their candidate, James Weaver, but he did not win the 1892 presidential election. He did get support. Continuing. The Panic of 1893 upset many Americans. We've already talked about the Panic of 1893. The populist ideas became more popular, but Republican William McKinley won the presidential election over William Jennings Bryan in 1896. The industrialized Northeast were the ones who supported McKinley, and the farmer struggles would not be heard. So again, farmers at this point typically tended to be Democrat. And that is the end of our notes for this unit, and you will have a test. So make sure you finish these notes. Rewind the video if you have not, or if you missed something, and make sure you turn these in.